Welcome to the global phenomenon, Surviving the Survivor, where we bring you the best guests in all of true crime. This is a STS special, Surviving My Biggest Case. Here's your host, Emmy Award-winning journalist, Joel Waldman.
What's up, STS Nation, and welcome to another episode of Surviving the Survivor, the podcast that promises to bring you the very best guests in all of true crime. This is an STS special, Surviving My Biggest Case with Dr. Detective. You heard that right. He's a PhD. He's a doctor. He's a detective. His name is Troy Looney. He began his career in Akron, Ohio with the Akron Police Department in 1992. He is still an active police detective in his 30-plus year law enforcement career, having started 20 years in uniform patrol, and now he is a detective in the Major Crime Against Persons Unit. He investigates all major crimes such as capital murder, homicide, overdose deaths, sexual assaults, felonious assaults, burglaries, kidnapping, officer-involved shootings, suicides, robberies, and even white-collar crimes. Great to have you back on Surviving the Survivor, Dr. Detective. Dr. Detective, what made you become a doctor once you were already a detective?
So thank you, Joel. Thanks for having me. So ironically, the two career paths kind of intersected. As I mentioned, I 20 years in patrol, and I wanted to finish my degree. So I have a degree, a PhD in leadership and business and marketing and so forth, because of some other outside interests and ventures. So yeah, it's kind of intersected with the casework, but becoming and having the PhD made me a better researcher. So it made me a better investigator, ironically, because it actually is the best of both worlds, merging forensics with investigative. And, so you have to actually be able to think with the job actively as a criminal and detective. So.
And how did you have the time? Were you doing like a night program or on your days off? How did you find the time to get a PhD? It's a long haul.
It is, yes. So actually, I started back in 2006 with the associate, and I was still on patrol. So working afternoon shift, I kind of went online and just never stopped from that point. So 10 years later, finished the PhD and just, ironically, just online, just time management, really. Time management and lack of sleep, of course.
Yeah.
Have to sacrifice somewhere.
100%. So,
Right.
Police departments, there's a kind of a lot of guy talk. I guess guys hang out. Do they bust your chops? Like, you make them call you Dr. Detective?
No, I do not. No, I've heard everything from, hey, is the lady having a baby in the lobby? And I'm like, I'll try to deliver it to, all the jokes, right? So that's just a part of law enforcement. And I still get it now, right? Don't let me make a mistake or a misspelling on a report. They're like, oh my gosh, you're supposed to be a doctor. You're supposed to be this and do everything. I'm like, okay, all right, you got me. So,
yeah. And was education important, like in your family growing up? Was it something that you knew one day you wanted to become a PhD on top of a detective?
Actually, no. Well, two things. So education is definitely important in my family. My father, late father, was an engineer for Goodyear. My mother was a librarian. So the irony of it, I used to hate reading books, right? But my mother was a librarian, so she'd help her with the card cataloging. Now it's a digital system, of course. But I was surrounded by books. So ironically, I started writing during the course of the PhD and before that even. So I published quite a few books as well on Amazon and continuing to publish and so forth. So it sparked my interest. So again, another intersection of education with hands-on experience and just become now an avid reader and learner, lifelong learner. So
wow. So your dad was an engineer. So
yes.
It's a serious job, especially for Goodyear, and your mom a librarian. So now we know where you get your intelligence from. So you're still an active detective in the Akron PD. You're going to be retiring soon, and
yes.
Even though we can't fully announce anything yet, we're hoping that you become part of the STS family in the very near future for something that we are working on behind the scenes. So I wanted to get you on because we've had other law enforcement officers, even attorneys and other people in the criminal justice field seems like everyone has that one big case in their career.
Okay.
Tell us about yours. What happened and what year? Take us back in time.
Okay, so talking about the biggest case, ironically, this is how we actually met. This case, we met at CrimeCon, of course, 2023. And this was the actual case that brought me there due to the good casework, the solutions, and outcome. This case started in 2016 with a fire that happened in Akron, Ohio. There was a fire which was determined to be arson, where there were people that were inside. They were actually killed. So this was an intentional fire that was set. At that time, in 2016, I was not the lead investigator, but I did assist the others with this case. That ultimately, there was no arrest made as a result. Unfortunately, in 2017, we had another fire on the same street, same method of operation, and it was determined that the same person was responsible for both fires. On the 2017 case, I was the lead investigator, and so I had to essentially backtrack from the year prior, working up to 2017 as well, and throughout that entire process. So we were able to determine this was the fire for 2017 was also intentionally set. It was an arson, and unfortunately, there were 7 victims in the second year fire. So for 2016, we had 2 people that died, and 1 person luckily got out. And for 2017, we had a family of 7. There were 2 adults and 5 children that were killed in that fire. So 9 people total.
Wow. So in the first fire, did you say 2?
Yes, there were 2 people. It was Lindell Lewis and Gloria Jean Hart that were killed in that fire.
Wow. And one escaped in the first fire. And
Yes.
then there's a second fire. Did you say 1 year later?
That's exactly correct. 1 year later, 2017, May of 2017, the second fire happened on the same street, 3-4 houses away from the first fire.
And unbelievably, in that fire, 7 family members are killed.
That's correct. And the family pet dog also. Yes.
Wow. Horrific. So, I don't think I've had anyone on to discuss arson, which is a whole other kind of pathological crime. But so You're the lead investigator on the 2017 case, but not on the 2016. So you get called in fresh on the 2017 case. Take me to that day. What are you doing? How does a call come in, and what do you have to do?
Okay, so that day that I worked midnight shift at the time. So working the midnight shift, that's was 10:30 p.m. to 7 a.m. or continuing on. We received the call from patrol and arson that Akron Fire Department responded to that location of Fultz Avenue and Fultz Street. I'm sorry. So they determined there was obviously active fire, and they determined people were inside at the time. Of course, the light bulb, goes off because we're like, man, the same street, same time of morning, roughly 11 p.m. or so. And it just brought back memories because we hadn't solved the first one.
I'm sorry, you said morning. So do you mean 11 a.m. it started?
Well, no. Well, I guess I should say working the midnight shift.
I see what you're saying.
Early morning, right.
The fire started at 11 at night, but it went into the early morning hours.
That's correct, yes.
So so you get a call that there's a fire, like a fully engulfed fire. Do you know that there's 7 people and this dog inside the house at the time? Like how soon after do you find this out?
So essentially we responded. We were contacted by Akron Fire Department to respond. We normally assist them with scene preservation, witnesses, and things of that nature, because they don't always know the cause of the fire. It could be electrical, could be accidental or intentional, and such as in this case. So at the time that we responded, we had no idea there were people inside until Akron Fire made entry, putting out the flames, extinguishing that, and finding actual bodies inside of the home. At that time, we were notified. We just still didn't know how many people.
I apologize if you said this earlier and I missed it. At this time in your career, are you an active homicide detective?
Yes, I was. I was working the midnight shift, and roughly I'd had about 7 or 8 years in to the midnight shift. Again, 20 years patrol. After 20 years, I start midnight shift as a major crimes detective and homicide. And I was about my 6th or 7th year in at that time.
Wow. Okay. So, this is not any small event. This is 7 people dead.
Yes.
How soon after arriving on scene do you then find out that 7 people have died? Is it immediate? Does it take you a while to figure this out?
So again, it's a fast moving pace and a lot of working parts also. So we have to first establish who lives at that residence, right? And if there's a family, how many people are present. We have to really establish their whereabouts. So there's actually an 8th family member, the 18-year-old that was away, working for Cedar Point. Fortunately, she was away, and she lost her entire family as a result of this fire. So we're literally canvassing the area, talking with neighbors, talking with friends and family, and this is a continuous effort. So this wasn't, it's not like at 7 a.m. we stopped. We were continuing throughout the day until the next night. So that first day was probably a 2 to 3 day extended investigative process.
And, it takes a while to investigate a fire. At what point are you told by the fire department, the Akron Fire Department, that this is in fact arson? It was set on purpose.
So again, initially we responded once the fire department determined that there were people inside. We're trying to get the backstory, establish the profile of the family, and learn who all lives there. Once we talked with neighbors, they were able to determine there's adults there and small children, 5 children or 6. And we then began to try to locate everyone related and or neighbors and so forth. So we didn't know immediately this was arson. We had an idea because of the previous fire the first year, but that had to be determined by Akron Fire, and we called in the state fire marshal. The arson investigator was Lieutenant Todd Webb at the time. He called in the state fire marshal, Brian Peterson, and they began immediately investigating burn patterns, determining if accelerants were used. So that had to be tested by the state fire marshals. So that takes several days. We actually worked.
No, but at this point, I'm sorry to interrupt, but at this point, you knew that the 2016 fire, you knew that was determined to be arson.
Yes, that's correct.
At this juncture. So even before you arrived on scene at this 2017, you knew that the year before there was an arson on this very same street. So yes. That's when you said kind of a light bulb was flickering in your head. Oh crap, this is the same street. There was an arson on here. Man, this could be arson, right? Yes. So that had to be on your radar right away, correct?
Yes, it was, correct. Absolutely, because when we heard the name of the street, Fultz Street, we said, oh no, not again, especially after we learned there were people inside. So we knew there was a strong possibility of it being arson, and that's how we worked the case.
So let's just take a half step back. You said that one person of this family, so it was really a family of 8, and this was a woman who was, I guess, at work or not at home at the time. Is that right?
That's correct. She was not at home. She was at like a work program where she stayed near Cedar Point, towards Cleveland, Ohio, north of that location. So she was actually had like a living arrangements there, and fortunately she was away, or she would have been present as well.
Wow. Okay. So, forget being a detective. Okay. Now, as a human being, I mean, you find out that 7 people from the same family and a dog are all killed. I mean, what does that do to you as a person? How does that elevate the entire situation?
Wow. So, again, just as a regular average person, it's horrific. It's terrifying. And it really makes us, it enhances the need to, get justice, to figure out what happened and who did this and who's responsible. So it's traumatic, basically. It's still traumatic to this day. There's been several specials and reenactments done, and of course here as well. But it always just impacts me. Literally, it's and even once we got a solution and made an arrest, which we'll talk about, it's still, you hug the family, you still feel that sense of loss. The youngest child was a 10-month-old baby.
Wow.
And a 3-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 14-year-old siblings, and the parents.
Wow. And how old is the one that was out of the house?
She was 18 years old, Brittany. 18 years of age at the time.
And I'll ask you about Brittany again, because I'm curious how she's doing today. And this is now about 7 years ago, but her life obviously will never be the same. She loses her entire family in one night. So, so you've been working, for 7-8 years, I guess you were saying, like the midnight shift as a detective. So you get on this call. Obviously, you're not going home because this is 7 dead people, not to mention 2 others from a previous year. So, where do you start?
Again, so it starts from the scene, essentially. Most case investigations start from the scene, or all, and we kind of work in a spiral method out from that. So we're talking with, neighbors, looking for surveillance cameras, looking for any statements, any persons of interest, obviously working in collaboration with the fire department, state fire marshals. We're trying to determine, what happened. So it's our job to canvass the area, look for surveillance and evidence, and then identify, again, the profile, what type of family is this? What's the family structure? Any kind of incidents prior? Any kind of reasoning or methods of operation why, if this were in fact arson, why someone may do this? So we canvassed the entire area on several occasions, talked with every neighbor. Of course, there were multiple neighbors outside that actually made calls to 911 to call the fire in. They actually came from around the corner, up the street, and so forth. And so we just continue that process.
And I have to assume that with this many dead people, it's now a media kind of firestorm. This has got to go all the way up in Akron to the police chief and the fire chief. Are they now, as the police chief, saying, "Hey, Troy, what's going on with this case? Where do we stand?" Does he start getting, or she? I don't know who the chief is. Do they start getting their hands kind of dirty in this case because it's so high profile?
Absolutely. So the chief, both fire and police, were actively at the scene on various occasions. We kind of coordinate that. So they kind of let us work diligently. And then we have our direct supervisors we report to. And they're, again, sergeant to lieutenant to captain and so forth and major. And they are present on scene. But we kind of relay our direct information to our immediate supervisor, sergeant, lieutenant, and they kind of filter information to the higher, administration and chief's office as needed. So we keep them abreast of what we're doing.
And so, take us, I think people are fascinated, including myself. This is like a real whodunit. That the 2016 is arson. This is deemed eventually to be arson. You start looking through surveillance video. I think the process of how you guys catch the arsonist in this case, or the killer in another case, or the arsonist is a killer. But my point is, how you guys go about catching a perpetrator is fascinating. So you really at the beginning you have no suspects, no persons of interest. How do you develop your investigation to get to a point where you start to be able to get something tangible?
Okay, so our investigation starts, and this was a very, very unique case, and I'll tell you, we start with, again, the profiles and the backstory of the family. Who were the victims, essentially, right? What were their lifestyles, any previous engagements or relationships? Not necessarily problems, but also definitely identifying if there were any previous problems or issues. In this case, for 2017, we did identify the wife. It was Angela Boggs and Dennis Huggins that were the parents of the 5 kids. Angela had a previous ex-husband, Patrick Boggs, that actually had tried to set her on fire, tried to kill her by setting her on fire, and did 11 to 13 years in prison for it. So, of course, another light bulb. It's like, this is our guy, right?
Wow. So just to recap, because I'm slow, it's a married couple in this house. The 5 kids, minus the one who wasn't there, are all deceased, and the parents. And then you come to find out that the wife was previously married, and that husband, the previous husband, tried to set her on fire.
Yes, that's correct.
Wow. So that's an
Yeah.
obvious. I mean, you guys had to say to yourself, it's him, right?
But we were thinking that, I mean, the strongest possibility, right? And it's an
Mhm.
interracial couple. He had a problem with their interracial marriage. So that stood out. We immediately continued our investigation across the board, but we immediately went to that direction to talk with him, actual interview, and then started the process with collecting forensics evidence, data, search warrants, and everything. We actually conducted search warrants at his place of residence outside of Akron, and obtained forensic data from his devices and so forth.
So he lives in proximity. It's not like he's living in Seattle now. He's nearby.
It's nearby in terms of 15, 20 minutes from Akron.
Yeah, I
So,
mean,
yes, in the same state, yes.
he's in the vicinity. So
Yes.
you execute search warrants, and to give me an idea time frame wise. So now, what time of year did this happen? When did this?
This was actually May. The second year fire was May of 2017. It actually happened on Mother's Day,
Oh my!
unfortunately.
Oh, wow.
The night of Mother's Day, yeah. So it makes it even worse.
Wow. Okay, so it's Mother's Day 2017, and then how long before you make this connection that her ex-husband tried to set her on fire? Is this within a few days, a few weeks?
This was actually within a few hours because we talked with all neighbors, family, friends. As we began to speak with friends, the friends informed us of what had taken place and the name of Patrick Boggs and the previous incident and him being in jail and prison for that. So this is like a fast-paced moving but collaborative effort around the clock and in various neighborhoods, communities, and settings, right? So we're traveling to outside of Akron, within Akron, workplace, family residences, and we had to identify that the 8-year-old was not in the home. So when we finally did that, this is all within a period of days, hours and days, that we identify Patrick Boggs, that story, and some other working components, and then identified the 8-year-old being still alive.
And Patrick Boggs, the ex-husband, he's no longer incarcerated. Is that right? He's out at this point?
To my knowledge, he is, to date, at the time of the fire, he was actually in jail for some unrelated matter. But
so he happened to be in jail that night.
Yes.
Night of the fire. Okay. So that's obviously problematic for you guys in terms of an investigative standpoint, because now you come to find out this guy was in jail when this happened. That's a pretty good alibi, right?
Yes. Well, let me backtrack a little bit. So he was actually in and out of jail. We actually picked him up on a warrant. He had an active warrant, and we sent the marshals to pick him up. Then we interviewed him. So it was in and out. His whereabouts had to be determined still. But yeah, it did present a problem. We interviewed him initially, and he was a little bit surprised, so he acted based upon what had happened. And but we were diligent about same protocol, same method of questions and so forth. But yeah, it was a cumulative process.
So you do your police work, and then I assume you guys come to the consensus, especially because he was in jail at the time this fire was set. You guys say to yourself, "Whoa, it's not our guy," right?
Essentially, of course, we had to rule out everything. So the persons of interest are always fully examined, but you have to allow the evidence to lead you, and to show you. You don't kind of try to build a case against anyone. You let the evidence speak for itself in the forensics. So we checked his place by search warrant. We checked video surveillance of his vehicle that had never moved. We checked phone records. We interviewed him. We offered him a polygraph at the time, and it was ultimately determined he was not the main person. But I always consider whether he had some involvement also. So nothing is off the table during the investigative process.
And Troy, let me ask you. I mean, did you personally interview him?
Yes, I did. I did myself initially.
And you come across as just a very nice, gentle guy. Are you like that in the interview room? I mean, are you? How is it going in the interview room?
So we have changing faces. I guess they say we have to be the best actors, or just be ourselves, right? So I do have several facets to me, and I wanted to be professional. respectful to build a rapport, right? Just have a conversation kind of like we're having. But at the same time, I did, there's different investigative techniques where you basically confront them ultimately with, hey, why would you do this? Did you do this? Right. And if so, tell me why. So I have different interchangeable, I guess, personalities.
Different Troy Loonies come out.
Right. Oh yeah, there's several. Yeah, I can have my Hulk gloves if I need to have them and smash them down. Right. So, but yeah, I haven't beat anybody up or anything. I've never touched anybody, but just want to get to the truth. Right. So.
Right.
Yeah.
So in this case, again, it appears this guy's got like a really strong alibi. He's in jail that night, even though he's got a horrific past of trying to set his ex-wife on fire, who's now deceased in an arson fire. So, any rational person, investigator or not, would probably have gone to him. I mean, you always go to the ex-husband or the spouse pretty much first anyway. Then you find this out. But then you guys, as a police department, as a unit, determine it wasn't him. He's not involved in this. So, do you get dejected? I mean, what's the feeling when you're like, whoa, we were sure this was going to be our guy, but this is not our guy? What's the emotion like?
So again, engaging the evidence, right? The surveillance video, it takes a while to download that. It takes a while to collect and archive that and then process it. And then they delivered that to us on a disc. So that took several days to do because there were neighbors with video that was intentionally directed towards Mr. Ford's home, ultimately our suspect. There were other surveillance cameras on the street that did not work, but we didn't know that until after we downloaded the hard drives. There were active cameras that did work that didn't collect anything. So that in itself is just one part of the puzzle. But we're thinking, we have to keep going. Again, as I say, you allow the evidence to lead you where, with what you have, with what's present. Also, we engaged with alarm codes also, talk about that a little bit later. That was truly significant in the case because we were able to marry the best of both worlds with forensics and hard digital data that built the timeline. So, as I mentioned, the surveillance that other neighbors had, Mr. Williams at 714 Fultz, his house was set directly across from our prime suspect, Stanley Ford, but there was video surveillance covering the street, the entire street, and showed the path of our initial suspect or images walking from the house direction and then running back towards a northwest direction. So we are waiting for fire marshals to come back with evidence whether these are accelerants and this was intentional. They were investigating the burn patterns and how the fire was actually set. We also had to look at the previous year fire, right? To look at the method of operation, how that suspect traveled, how that person or grainy image on video walked. We looked at the cadence of how they were walking. It was very unique with the walk pattern or the gait, I guess, as it's called, with the person, how they walk. So all that came to fruition.
So you see someone, and this is interesting because this is just right away reminding me of another case that I've covered that's a unsolved, cold case now out of Toronto, Canada, but it's extremely high profile. It was the murder of a couple named Barry and Honey Sherman. They're the 12th wealthiest couple in Canada when they were murdered, murdered. But eventually investigators found surveillance video and they dubbed him the walking man. There's a guy who walks with a very odd gait, with a limp, and they think that could be him, but they've never been able to locate him. So in this case, something similar. You're looking at surveillance video and you see someone walking with a very distinctive gait. So what do you do with that?
So essentially, a couple things. We see the video surveillance of a grainy image. So there's really no face of a person. It's kind of like, reminds me of the Bigfoot video. And we joked about that, whereas you see that image in the woods walking and it has a certain swing of the arm, right? And it turns and looks at the camera. Ironically, those things can be helpful in a case investigation. So in this case, that's how we kind of dub that, right? This image has a particular walk. One arm kind of hangs back and the other arm swinging. Mm-hmm. So the way we identified our ultimate person of interest was during the search warrants of Stanley Ford, there were surveillance captured by fire arson. They just always take a video of the activity going on, right? So they happened to catch Mr. Ford with that certain walk, right? Very similar. So we observed that.
All right, hold on. Let me stop you there.
Yes.
So Stanley Ford is eventually the person you name as a suspect, and I think eventually gets convicted for this crime. But so this, and Stanley Ford has a weird gait. So you notice on some surveillance video that someone's got this Bigfoot walk, for lack of a better phrase.
Yes.
And then you're telling me that the night that, or I guess in the following days when the arson investigators are out there, they're filming the whole scene, and they happen to catch this guy at some point on their own film. Is that it?
That's correct. Yes. So they have their own video surveillance they keep during search warrants and of scene preservation. And they happened to catch Mr. Ford walking a certain way. And that stood out to us because, of course, we're watching hours and hours of video throughout the night, throughout the day, multiple investigators, different sets of eyes. And ultimately, the arson investigator, Lieutenant Webb, said, hey, we've got video of this guy. Let's see if we can compare. So we also had to call in the FBI and the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, to assist with this. So this was a collaborative of different agencies. And the FBI agent, Brad Barkhurst, was able to merge the two videos, pair them side by side to compare the walk of the actual suspect during the fires, of black and white video, grainy, with his search warrant execution video obtained by AFD.
Now, the Akron Fire Department video, how far after the fire, I guess, was extinguished, was this was it taken within the same, like within a 24-hour period, or was this much later on?
This was actually much later. I guess I can say much later in terms of days. So,
this guy was there days later, right?
He was, yes. And the interesting thing, he was actually, we interviewed everyone on the street. Everyone's outside, you know, your neighbor's house is on fire, fully engulfed, and there's people and they're killed inside. Every neighbor's outside. They're traumatized. They're talking with us. The only person that was not outside was Mr. Ford at the time of the fire. Now, the surprising thing is his wife is one of the 911 callers.
Wow.
The night of the fire.
And again, I apologize if I missed this, but where does Stanley Ford live relative to the house that was engulfed?
Okay, so to put it in context, Mr. Ford lives at the corner of Hillcrest and Fultz. Across the street from that is 719, where the first year fire took place, 719 Fultz. The second year fire was 3 to 4 houses away at 697 Fultz. So he's within literally a half a block radius, maybe 50 to 75 yards away.
Wow. So
yes.
The night of the actual fire, his wife, whoever Mrs. Ford is, calls 911, but everyone's out on the street, as you would be, wondering what's going on, except you realize Stanley Ford is not out there that night.
That's correct, yes. And neither he or his wife were outside. And of course, we're canvassing, so we're going to try to talk to everyone on the street, whether they're home or not. If they're not home, we'll come back later, and that's what we did. So ultimately, we went back later to talk with Mr. Ford and his wife because she's a caller, and we wanted to know what she saw, what she observed, and his behavior was very odd. Again, one thing that stood out at that time was his response. We said, well, hey, would you like to come downtown to talk with us? He's very defensive, and he began talking. He did invite us into his kitchen area. Now, this is a key point that sparked my interest. Myself and Detective Ron Gary were interviewing him. And of course, working throughout the night, throughout the day, we went home, got a couple hours sleep, came right back in. We go in pretty much the next night, that same night after the fire took place. And we're like, hey, what do we have to do? What are we considering? What ends do we have to shore up? Who have we not talked to? We haven't talked to Mrs. Ford. Anita Ford's her name, or Stanley Ford. So we knock on the door. He invites us in. Ironically, he starts making comments of, oh, my wife called. Yeah, she called. Oh, I was asleep at the time. And she looked at him. She gave him a look like, really? Like, so she couldn't believe it because she knew different. So that stood out.
When that happens, when he's like, oh, I was asleep, and the wife's looking at him like, no, you weren't. Do you guys know each other well enough, you and your partner, that you're like, this guy needs further questioning? Like, do you?
Oh yeah. Yeah, my partner and I, Ron Gary, we've worked many cases, many other cases together, of various nature, robberies, homicides, and so forth. So we have done a lot of work in collaboration. And when she looked at him, I looked at my partner, and we right. So yeah, it stood out clearly.
And this is the next night now. So tell me, walk me through this. What do you say to Mr. Ford at this point?
So essentially, again, we were trying to say, hey, Mr. Ford, would you like to come downtown? We want to show you video, pictures, you and your wife. He's very defensive. Oh, no, I can't do that. No, I can't do that. I might need an attorney. And we're like, well, why would you need an attorney? Just to, your wife's a caller. So very defensive. He refused to come downtown. I said, well, how about this? We'll come back. And, when times are good, or you can bring your wife with you. We'll come back in the morning, because he started saying attorney. And we're like, well, that might not be necessary. So we planned to come back that morning. And again, still working the case throughout the night. Ultimately, we got to the point of a search warrant for his 2 residences, because Mr. Ford and the Ford family lived at 1370 Hillcrest at the corner of Hillcrest and Fultz. Mr. Ford also occupied a secondary home right behind his home. That's 1374 Hillcrest. That was his late deceased mother's house, but he used it like a storage workplace. So no one actually resided there. That proved to be significant in the case also, because of the video surveillance that captured him going to and from the secondary home, turning the lights off and on, coming back out of the home, and the same figure, grainy figure on video, moving about in and out of the home back to his home, ultimately inside the door at the time before the fire, during the fire, and after the fire.
I'm always like interested in inside baseball. So back to this conversation where you're canvassing, you realize again that Stanley Ford didn't come out that night. You realize the wife's a caller, so you went back the next night. You talked to them, and then this whole thing happens where he says I was asleep, and the wife gives him a crazy look, like, "No, you're not." And then he starts mentioning an attorney. I don't want to go downtown. When you and your partner leave the house that night, leave them behind, like, what do you guys say to each other? We got to get this guy down here. What do you say?
So again, 2 things. First thing we talked about was that expression, the look, and we said, this guy, he's just not right. Now, backtracking a little further, his name came up in the first year fire of 2016 because the neighborhood people would call him Crazy Stan. Of course, I never talked to him, but even when the initial investigators approached him in the 2016 fire, he was very standoffish and almost bladed his body while he was talking with them, like in a fight stance almost. But they determined some other people may have been better suited, or other persons of interest that they determined may have been involved. So at the time, he was never initially interviewed again until the next year when we talked with him.
Wow. Do you run like priors on Crazy Stan, like that night? Like, do you go back and just check your database to see, hey, has this guy ever been arrested for anything?
Yes, we do. So essentially, we run our database is and our method is comprised of checking everyone, even the witnesses, suspects, neighbors, persons of interest such as Mr. Ford. So we run a check on everyone and just kind of see if there are any reports of nature or incidents that took place prior to, problems that may exist in the neighborhood itself. So we have an entire collective data examination of the entire neighborhood. So that's all working reports and so forth. And there was actually a 3rd fire involved with this case. We found out later. So fire happens 2016, 2 people are killed. We discovered another fire January of 2017 before the second year fire had occurred. Now, this 3rd fire, we call it the 3rd fire because we didn't learn until later, but this was a car fire. And as a result, Mr. Ford was involved with an altercation between the 17-year-old son and the 9-year-old daughter. I think they were shortcutting through his yard and they had exchanged words. Mr. Ford threatened to kill the kid at the time. And the next day, their car set on fire in the driveway south of this street. So essentially, Hillcrest, another half block to the south, at the corner, there's like an apartment complex. There was a rag stuffed into the gas tank of a Dodge Durango and set on fire. Fortunately, the part of the car was burned, but it didn't explode. But we learned later that Mr. Ford was involved in that incident as well.
So while you're investigating this, and let me ask you this. Do you do anything different because it's arson? Like, do you have to get into an arsonist's mind? Because I know very little about arsonists. Do you know, I mean, along this journey that I know you didn't want to take, did you find out why arsonists act, with fire? What the psychology is behind it?
So again, thank you. Excellent question. So we work in collaboration with, again, the arson investigators that specialize in that area. So we're always in communication and talking and asking questions. Could this have been electrical? Could this have been charcoal or something because it was Mother's Day? Could have been a grill or trash can. Whatever the case is, anything and everything's on the table. But we leverage those that are the experts with their expertise, right? So we're relying on arson investigators and the state fire marshals while they're testing to still come out and, interview with us. They may have other questions to lead to the psychological element or mental health element if that's relevant. What we found is, with the psychology of it, whether it's a fetish or some kind of, mental health situation, it's just contingent upon each individual. Everyone's different, and no two cases are always alike. But unless you have the patterns, like in this case, or similarities in how the fire was set, there was a particular burn pattern that was set in like a V shape at a point or corner of the house, so it actually covered the entire portion and escape routes for the victims. So that was actually identified by state fire marshals. They determined accelerants were used, and it was not done by charcoal. So again, excellent question. Speaking to the science of that was significant in testifying as well, because I asked the fire marshal, could this have been charcoal? Right? Because we had a report that someone had a grill on the porch and it was accidental, which it was not. This was a flash type fire. And, speaking to, the experts, they shared with me how the fire was set, and charcoal doesn't burn in that pattern. This was more of a immediate, harsher accelerant to initiate that.
By the way, if you're enjoying this conversation, which is fascinating to me, with Dr. Detective Troy Looney, please subscribe to Surviving the Survivor and hit that like button. And you can also support the show on Patreon. We're talking about a case where Dr. Detective Troy Looney, who's an active detective in Akron, Ohio, still, at least for a few more months, is talking about a 2016 and 2017 case of arson. The 2017 case, 7 family members were killed, including the dog, and in the 2016, 2 people were killed. Those are 9 lives lost on one street in Akron. So, Dr. Detective, you start to hone in on this guy, and you've got to, execute search warrants. When do you get the sort of the aha big moment break here?
Okay, excellent. Question. So, again, working around the clock after that initial interview contact with Mr. Ford, we're back to the station, back to other locations to interview. So we're back at the station and we're looking at video surveillance, and we're seeing this grainy figure moving about the neighborhood, in and out of the homes of Mr. Ford and his secondary home next door during the time of the fire. As I mentioned, the aha moment would have been the video surveillance also, and the alarm codes that we requested. So once we request data, obviously it's, every agency or entity has a different time frame of delivery, right? Different estimated time to deliver. So it could take days or weeks before we get the information. The aha moment was when Akron arson investigators were watching video, because we have multiple people and eyeballs on this. It's a lot for 1 or 2 individuals. Mm-hmm. So hours and hours and days of video. Akron arson identified this grainy figure leaving that secondary home up and down the street. And ultimately, this is after the fire set. So Mr. Ford lived so close to where the fire was set that his entire home was illuminated by the fire. So it actually made it better for us to see the video and what was going on. But that big aha moment was when the figure's moving about, walks down towards that location, comes running back, and you can see the fire as it's more engulfed, lighting up the screen and the video surveillance. So that figure goes into 1374, his late mother's home, turns lights on, sets the alarm, leaves that home, goes right next door, and we can see the screen door open of who was Mr. Ford going into his home on video. That was significant enough for us to get search warrants. And also at the time, it came back that the fire was caused by accelerants. Luckily for us, came back at around the same time. This was intentional. We've got this guy on video. Let's get the search warrants for both homes. And that's what we did.
And when you go into the deceased mother's home, what do you find? You find these accelerants?
So essentially, again, this was twofold because during the search warrant, that's when my interview with him took place. I'll talk about that shortly. We go into the home. This is like another team effort of arson, fire marshals, Akron police, Akron fire department officers, other detectives that we pulled in. And there's probably 20 to 30 of us at the time. Go into the home, we seize clothing, we seize a gas can, we seize other potential concoctions of methods of accelerants and lighter fluid and so forth. We actually found a pair of tennis shoes that were put in the trash that night after we left Mr. Ford with the initial contact and the wife looking at him. The search warrant took place really that next morning. And we found a pair of tennis shoes that had gasoline after they were tested. It was determined that there was gasoline and accelerants on the shoes. Why would you throw tennis shoes in the trash after we come to your house? So that was significant for us. And accelerants were identified. Of course, whether you can match the identical accelerants or not is yet to be determined. But we knew that we had the right person with that video and everything else coming to fruition for us.
Yeah, I mean, with gasoline on your sneakers, with an arson and all that combined, that is a pretty big clue, as you guys would say, in your world. So
yes.
From that time where you find the sneakers with the gasoline, how long before you move in and make an arrest on him?
So essentially, after our interview and the search warrants took place, this was a matter of days. Within days, we had the arrest warrant because we had to present everything to our county prosecutors and, show them all the evidence that we have, talk about the initial contact with Mr. Ford, talked about Mr. Boggs as well. We pretty much vetted and looked at every piece of evidence, all the leads we could to rule Mr. Boggs out. And now Mr. Ford's our primary target. Again, with the search warrants of his home. And I had a monumental interview with him in the car. I actually talked with him in front of the house inside my DB car while the search warrant was being executed. So I walked into the home later to see what was obtained, but I spent an hour and a half talking with him and actually interviewing him because, again, he wouldn't come downtown. He refused. So I said, well, we'll talk here in the car.
And so what do you do in a car? You flip on... you have a body cam, or how are you recording this in the car?
No, I actually had a small digital handheld recorder that I use for all of my interviews. I still use that now to this date, even by phone, right? I'm talking with fraud victims. So I had this digital handheld recorder. I set it around the dashboard. I read him his Miranda rights, and I said, let's just have a conversation. Of course, he's kind of partially distracted because you have like people in and out of your mom's home and your family home, and but he talked with me, and I kind of settled him down. I said, let's have a conversation. So we talked for that hour and a half. I put him in the front seat intentionally, took off the child lock, left the door unlocked, so he could have left any time.
It's just you and him.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
And this is Crazy Stan. At any point, are you worried during this interview this guy's going to try to attack you or something?
No, I was not worried. So I mean, that would have had to turn on the other me. So, but yeah, fortunately, no. He was. We had a conversation. Now the other detectives that were present, they would walk up to the car, and he actually knew them. Detective Johnny Bell would walk up to the car. He kind of had a different rapport with Mr. Ford because he worked a side job. See him at a church and things. So he walked up and he left. So still myself and Mr. Ford.
So how does that interview go? Like, how do you start that interview?
Again, trying to build a rapport. I mean, we talked with him the night before. I said, "Hey, Mr. Ford, we came out last night. We told you we'd be back this morning, and we just wanted to talk to you. We wanted you to come down. We could have done this downtown, but it worked out perfect for us because he's like, man, you guys are wrong. You guys are wrong. You're in my house." I said, "Well, you said you talked with us, so let's talk now." He said, "Okay." And I read him his Miranda, like I do. I still even read witnesses' Miranda rights because I never know who's who and who could be interchangeable in the sense of a crime. But I knew he was a person of interest, and I wanted to make sure I did it properly with protocol. So read him his rights, and we talked.
And does he give you anything in this car interview?
Actually, he did. There were key elements that we talked about because I started with, hey, your wife called, and, we just wanted to talk with you and her. And I'm like, you're the only person that's not outside. Your neighbors came from around the corner, next door. And he said, oh, I was sleeping. I was tired. So he went through an entire story, and I kind of let him talk to tell me, well, you said you weren't outside, but tell me about your day. So he initially started telling me, well, I was outside, and I was next door getting lemon balm tea leaves, and I was taking the TV next door and back and forth. And because, ultimately I confronted him with, you're on video, and, does anybody else come to your house? And did anyone visit? He's like, oh, no, just me. So ultimately he did tell me he was not at the point down the street at the fire to telling me I was down there, but I don't know why. So this is after an hour and a half of, I gave him every option and every theme I could build as far as why this took place. Were there bad people there? At one point during the interview, he said, yeah, there's bad people. I'm like, were the kids, the baby, or the adults? He's like, both. The kids break car mirrors, and they're selling dope down there, and things of that nature. So tried to blame the victims, essentially. But ultimately, at one point, he did tell me, when I did the confrontation, we got you on video. It's 20 seconds from when the grainy figure walks down and runs back 20 seconds later after the fire set. I said, we got you on video running. He's like, I wasn't running, I was jogging. But so he kind of told himself, but he's still like, I didn't do this. So I'm like, Stanley, we got you. And at that point, I'm pounding the table. We got you. And just tell us why. He still denied it. But ultimately, he did say that he's like, I actually made him an offer. I said, if I prove it, you'll tell me, right? Man to man. And he's like, yeah. And then I told him, we got you on video, fire set. You go from your mom's house into your house. He's like, if you got somebody going in my house, that's me. I said, I know it's you. So now tell me why. He never did say the why, but.
So amazing police work. You guys find him. Obviously, you arrest him at this point. Yes. From the point of arrest till the trial, how much time passed?
Okay, so this was, again, two different segments, because the trial started a few months into, like, after the case, but ultimately then there's COVID, right? So COVID, the trial starts, COVID emerges, and the trial actually was declared a mistrial and canceled because of COVID. So 4.5 years later, it comes back and to be tried again after this initial start. And 4.5 years later, we got the conviction.
Kudos to you. Did you, how old is Stanley Ford? Or was
at the time, he was roughly 56 or so.
56.
56, 52.
And he never, did he ever in court or ever since, did he ever say why he set this fire?
So again, no, he actually denied setting the fire. He denied even being outside, right? Initially, I was never outside. After I showed him, I have video of you next door. Someone's turning the lights on. And, again, I preface this with, who has access to your mom's house? Oh, it's just me and my wife. Anybody else have keys? Anyone visit? Anyone? He's like, no. Who has access to your home? Just myself and my wife. And he had two young girls at the time, like 5 and 7. So no one comes over. No one came over that night. So he basically locked himself into only he and his wife had access. And the alarm codes, only he and his wife had access to the codes. So he was actually setting the alarm codes and disarming the codes, moving about the neighborhood before the second year fire happened. He walks down the street, fire set, he runs back to mom's house, sets the alarm, then goes to his residence. Now, interestingly enough, in the year 2016, the first fire, same grainy figure on video, but it goes a different direction because this fire is across the street, kind of adjacent to his home. We see that same figure with the same gait, walking, kind of arm swinging, one arm still, and in a hooded vinyl, some type of clothing. But the first year fire, they had 3 attempts before it was actually ignited. So you see the figure walking about, setting fire, and then running back. It goes out, they come back a second time, tried to set it, it goes out. Third time, figure comes back, sprays the house with accelerant. Now, we had video from the first year fire, 719. That home had surveillance video showing the figure spraying fluid on the house. And then ultimately on the third ignition, it was engulfed, and they were unfortunately successful in committing the arson. And that figure then runs back towards Mr. Ford's residence.
Yeah. So this trial after COVID, is it for, apologies again if you answer this, is it for both cases?
Yes. So
for the 9 murders.
That's correct. Yeah. So there were actually 26 or 29 counts total. It was determined based upon the neighborhood canvas, the video surveillance from the first year fire and the second year fire, all the forensic data and the alarm codes, that everything matched, and we were able to build a timeline of what took place. I requested the alarm codes for Mr. Ford's mother's home, and ironically, there was activity on each day a fire was set. That at that time of morning or evening, there were disarming, alarming of the codes. It has his name on the responders list or the fire alarm notification list. And even that third fire we learned of, the Mr. Ford was inside his second residence, arming, disarming the alarm. Those 3 times throughout the year were very crucial because each had an activity on the alarm that matched the video surveillance and showing the movement about. So that was significant.
Wow.
To merge the 2 cases together.
So he's ultimately convicted. What is he sentenced to?
This was a death penalty case also. So the consideration prosecutor said, this is horrific. This is Akron's worst case we've ever had. Most number of deaths in one incident or crime that occurred. They tried him for the death penalty, and the jurors convicted him of 9 life sentences plus 20 years. It was 11-1 voted for the death penalty, and 1 person held out because they felt he had some kind of mental health condition. Now, there were evaluations also to determine there could have been some kind of spots on his brain, but ultimately he was found competent to stand trial. So they voted 11-1 to put him to death, but that's fine. Life is fine with me as well. 9 life sentences plus 20 years.
This guy will never, ever see the light of day, as he should not.
Correct.
Does he happen to have children? Does he have
He
kids?
does. He has 2 little girls. Yes. At the time, a 5 and a 7-year-old.
Wow.
That live with him and the wife in the home.
And during the trial, did anyone on the defense testify that he never took the stand, I take it?
He did not. I think they offered him that option and he declined to do so. He would have had every chance to tell his side.
Yeah. And did the defense have any expert witnesses that basically said this is a crazy guy? He's mentally unhealthy?
They did. So defense brought in several different psychologists and other PhD level witnesses. And there were 3 or 4 psychologists, forensic psychiatrists that came in. They showed brain scans of Mr. Ford's brain showing some spots. They basically were trying to save his life, essentially, to not receive the death penalty. So they brought in multiple witnesses in that context, and they tried to muddy the waters, as we say, with other potential witnesses from the first year and second year fire, with the ex-husband being with that situation. Of course, they're trying to create some doubt. I mean, I would have done the same, especially with that history.
Yeah. And then I was doing some research. So I know you were on the witness stand in this trial.
Yes.
What was it like for you to give testimony? How is it for size?
So this case of this size, I really prepared for it. So it actually worked out wonderful for myself. Of course, the nerves are there, but when you know your case, you've done the work, and you want justice, you go to every length to make sure you get that. And actually, I was pretty happy with my testimony. It worked out really well because a very challenging defense lawyer, the same defense lawyer that we went against, was our defense lawyer for the police department to defend us in any officer-involved shooting. So he knows policy well, he knows procedure, but ultimately it was trying, but it was a wonderful outcome, and testifying was great. So I'm happy with how it went.
And then I promised I'd come back to the 18-year-old. I think you said her name was Brittany. I hope I didn't butcher that.
Yes.
Was she at the trial, and have you spoken to her since?
Again, so initially, before the start of the first year trial, we did speak. I talked with her grandmother and so forth, but she did not attend the trial. I think it was too hard for her. I can't speak to why she didn't, but I believe it was too hard for her. I know the family of the couple, they were there. Some of the family members were there and friends, but for the second year trial, but ultimately it was too hard for her. And I haven't spoken to her since. I know that she relocated and so forth.
Wow, she lost, for those who are tuning in late, she lost both her parents and 5 siblings, correct? Both parents?
Her stepfather, mother, and all her siblings, yes.
Wow, and the dog.
The dog, yes.
Crazy. And during the entire course of the trial, I assume the defense never gave an explanation. They just denied, but never said why. Do you have an idea why he set these fires? You think it was a mental health issue, like an obsession he couldn't control, or you think he was looking for retribution? What do you think it was?
I think it's a combination of all the above, because what I did identify is that every time, Mr. Ford, first of all, thought he was like the savior of the neighborhood, like the self-proclaimed neighborhood watchman, angel over the neighborhood. So he looked out for the elderly, was real friendly with the elderly people in the neighborhood, but he was self-proclaimed watchman. So I did identify that every time he had a problem with someone directly or incident, a fire was set at their residence. So going back to 2016, in that fire, Lindell Lewis was a retired steel worker, and he would open up his house to people in the neighborhood. They'd have barbecues and music and things. And he had some transient people with some issues he'd rent the basement out to. So, of course, Mr. Ford, having his family there and daughters, he was more protective and didn't like the activity. So at one point in time, they were friends, but then things took a turn for the worse before the fire. And Mr. Ford had some altercations with people that were living in the basement, literally fist fights in the street. Exchanged words with Lindell Lewis, and Mr. Lewis had cameras installed prior to the fire because he said, this guy is crazy, he may do something to me. And unfortunately, Mr. Lewis had hip surgery and was on a walker. So Mr. Ford took advantage of that when he set the fire, and just terrible. So with that, so he sets fire to Lindell Lewis, and his girlfriend Gloria Jean was visiting. She was killed also. Then the second year fire, which I'll call 2017, problem with, again, just the lifestyle maybe. So he thought of the family. Now, I guess there were some issues of marijuana sales or whatever on a small level, but no reason to kill anyone, right?
Yeah.
And so, again, when you're self-appointed watchman, you're looking at everything in the neighborhood. But Mr. Ford claimed the 14-year-old kid was breaking car mirrors and, things that teenagers do, but there was never any arrest made from that. So,
yeah, not really a reason to set fire to a house with no reason ever to do that.
Right.
Well, this is another fascinating surviving my biggest case with Dr. Detective Troy Looney of the Akron PD. This is a whole different ball of wax. Do you know if any special precautions are made in prison? Because it sounds like this guy, if he can get his hands on anything flammable, do they take any special steps, do you know of, in state prison?
I would hope so. I know that, initially the judge tried to make him spend each day for the kids, the 5 children. She tried to make him serve his day in isolation, or I forgot what it's called, but in isolation They ruled that unconstitutional, so that was the only precaution I think that was, or provision, I guess they tried to attempt. The judge wanted to order that, but that was ultimately turned over.
That sounds like a cool judge, actually, because it sounds like this guy deserves it. Wow. What an amazing story. This is a different look at a different sort of crime, which is arson, which has its own fascinating psychological perspective. Maybe one day we'll get the world famous profiler Ann Burgess on to talk about why arsonists do what they do. But for now, big thanks to Dr. Detective Troy Looney. Thank you for tuning in to Survive the Survivor. Love you, America. Love you, Akron, Ohio. We will see you next time.